Thank you again for joining us on the program. Now, the 11th Extraordinary Summit of the African Union, AU, which ended Sunday in Addis Ababa, has been hailed as fruitful. At the meeting, 55 members of the continental body agreed to some proposed reforms for the Commission. This last weekend's meeting was seen as a frantic attempt to push through reforms that have been in the pipelines for nearly 2 years. The AU in 2016 had charged its chairperson, Rwandan President Paul Kagame, with getting reforms passed. And the one reform now is to make the AU less dependent on foreign donors by making member states pay their dues. Although not all of his reforms were passed, the Rwandan leader, Paul Kagame, has welcomed the progress made in the two-day summit.
We
go back in details on this meeting and its implications with Pierre Mukoko, Director of the Institutional Reform Unit of the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Mr. Pierre Mukoko, bonjour. You are the head of the unit in charge of reforms of the African Union. What is your assessment of the recent extraordinary summit of the Union devoted to the issue which closed on Sunday in Addis Ababa?
The
outcome is very positive and pleasing. The heads of state and government, who met for the first time to focus on the reform of the African Union, have taken very important decisions. That is regarding the reform of the African Union Commission, which is, as you know, the executive arm of the Union. Decisions regarding the mandate of the new African Union Development Agency, which will now be called the NEPA Development Agency. Another very important decision that has been taken is the strengthening of the sanctions regime. You know that the Union is trying to strengthen its financial autonomy. The Union has reduced its budgetary dependence on operating budgets and operations from 60% to 30%, initially dependent on partners. There's also the question of the Peace Fund to finance peacekeeping operations. So, that is what was done during these 2 days, during this first extraordinary summit devoted to the reforms of the African Union. A sanctions regime has been put in place for states that do not respect their commitments. Does this mean that the AU was operating without a binding mechanism for countries in terms of contributions?
Good.
There are sanctions that exist. We have sanctions regime that exists in the Union texts. But they have shown their limits, because until then, it was enough for a state that is in arrears to pay a small amount last minute, that is to be able to take part in the summit. Therefore, there are clarifications that after a period of 6 months, from the beginning of the budget year, states that have not paid 50% of the contribution will be classified as in arrears. And from there will be a series of sanctions, which are of 3 kinds: so-called short-term sanctions, intermediate sanctions, and complex sanctions. So we will go from warning sanctions to the last category of sanctions, non-participation in the work of the Union. Another important point, that of the restructuring of the AU Commission. Have the head of state and government agreed to give the precise of this organ a little more independence in its functioning? Oh no, there is no independence from the heads of state. The Commission is set up by the member states. The President of the Commission, the Vice President of the Commission, the commissioners are elected by the member states. The Commission has been strengthened in its restructuring, in the rationalizing of its work, in the division of labor that will be established between itself and the regional economic communities. You know, we are in an intergovernmental process. Decisions are not taken without broad consultation. The process was a broadly participatory and inclusive process, and a broad consensus and developed, and it was a consensus that was presented and adopted by the heads of states and governments. To finish, only 22 heads of states and governments out of 55 member countries took part in the summit. Are there any guarantees that the reinforcements undertaken will meet with the approval of the presidents who are absent? Of course, diplomatic law. There is the plenipotentiary concept. The heads of states are still present. They are physically represented when they are represented either by their minister or foreign affairs or any other governmental authority of their choice. They are diplomats. That is, they are the ones who make the decisions. There we have both the heads of states who are there, the heads of states of the Prime Minister's government who are there, and those who are unable to travel were represented by their ministers of foreign affairs who know the conventional point of view of diplomatic law. Thank you for all these precisions. Pierre Mokoko Mbonjo is the director of the Institutional Reform Unit of the African Union in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
De réforme institutionnelle de l'Union africaine qui s'exprimait depuis Addis Abeba, en Éthiopie.